Hello, I'm Carlo from All You Can Board, and today I'm going to be reviewing Savannah Park. So this is a game that is co-designed by Michael Kiesling and Wolfgang Kramer, and it's published by Capstone Games in their family line, as well as Deep Print Games. So you might remember from your childhood, or you might have kids who have these kind of puzzles lying around. This reminds me of those slide puzzles, where basically you had you have a picture that has things all out of order, and there's one empty space, and you have to slide one thing over, and then slide something else into that empty space, and then that empty space creates room to slide another thing over, and you're trying to put everything together to make a picture, or sometimes there's a bunch of numbers, and you got to put them all in order. So it reminds me a lot of that, as well as one of my favorite games from the last few years called Tiny Towns. I'm going to tell you a bit more about that, but first I'm going to tell you a bit more about how this sort of abstract puzzle plays. I'm also going to take a moment to mention very quickly that this is a review copy that was provided to us by the publisher Capstone Games. So in Savannah Park, players all start with the same board and the same 33 tiles that have a variety of animals. There's 6 different animals in the game, and you basically have areas on your board that have grass, trees, and these bushfires that either have 1, 2, or 3 bushfires. You basically randomly distribute all your tiles on one side. They all have the same drawings or same artwork on the other side as well. And you're basically randomly distributing them on the empty spaces on your board. You'll have 2 left over that get put on 2 grass spaces of your choice, and then you're going to start the game. It's a game that plays simultaneously, so all players are basically going at the same time. The only thing is you take turns choosing a tile. So on your turn, you're going to say, for example, single elephant, or 2 giraffes, or, the watering hole with the giraffe, elephant, and rhinoceros. And whichever tile you name, everyone has to pick that tile up off their board, flip it over to the other side, and place it somewhere else on the board. So you can't put it on the same space. You can place it on grass, trees, or any empty spaces. At the start of the game, your board won't have any empty spaces, so you'll have to place it on a grass or a tree. You can't put it on a bushfire, and you can't put it on the rock in the middle of your board. Once a tile has been placed anywhere on your board, it cannot be moved for the rest of the game. Then it'll be the next player's turn. They'll pick an animal or a tile. Everyone has to do the same thing with that tile, and that's pretty much how the game plays out until everyone has placed all 33 other tiles on the other side. Once that happens, you just go through final scoring, which basically you go through a couple categories at the end where, any tiles that you have surrounding a single bushfire that have only a single animal essentially get chased away by the fire. Or if they have 2 bushfires, then any tiles that have 2 animals get chased away, and similarly for the 3 bushfires, then you're going to score 1 point for every grass tile that is showing, 3 points for every tree that is showing, and then you're going to go through the 6 categories of animals one at a time, and you're going to score it kind of in a similar way if you're familiar with King Domino, where you're basically looking at your biggest chain of animals of each type, and then you're going to multiply that number of animals by the amount of watering holes that animal is at that are all connected adjacently. So for example, if you have, 8 giraffes that are all connected in a contiguous line. They don't have to be like in a straight line as long as the tiles are all touching. If you have, let's say, 8 giraffes and 2 watering holes with giraffes on them, you would score 16 points for giraffes. And you're going to go through each animal type. And that's basically all the rules of the game explained to you already. It's a very simple game that has very simple rules, only a couple pages of rules really. There are a couple of variants which I'm going to get into after, but that's pretty much how you play the game. So now I want to talk about how the game actually feels and a bit more about how it plays. And I mentioned at the start that it kind of reminds me of those slide puzzles. And that's because, as I mentioned at the start, there are no empty spaces on your board, but you're going to have to move something around somewhere on your board constantly. You're just moving tiles to different places. So because you want to be grouping animals together, let's say you want to have your big grouping of elephants. If you already have one elephant flipped over and you think, okay, that's where I want to put my elephants, let's say that elephant is already surrounded by other bunch of tiles and there's no empty spaces. Before other players say, pick another elephant tile to put there, if you can't move that new elephant next to the other ones, then you're going to be potentially breaking up your elephants and you want to be grouping them all together. So you want to be moving, once you establish your first, let's say, elephant tile on the other side, you want to be moving away the other tiles that are near the elephant to create space to then move a new elephant back there later. So I mentioned the slide puzzles because you want to put things somewhere, but in order to put it there, you have to create space first by moving something out of the way. So you're shifting things around. It's very puzzly in that sense, and a lot of the time, in order to put something where you want it, it means putting something else somewhere where you don't want that other thing to go. Or sometimes you have to cover up one of your grass spaces to lose a point at the end of the game for the less grass showing, or you're going to cover up a tree that's going to normally score you 3 points, or you might even have to move an animal next to one of those bushfire spaces where it's going to get chased away at the end. But it's a game of prioritization where you're trying to group things together and get that sort of multiplicative scoring. And, you know, if you're only going to score, let's say, 5 or 6 points anyway for a certain animal, then you can maybe afford to lose one of those or two here and there and only lose a couple of points. But if you've already got a big grouping of your elephants or your giraffes or whatnot, you don't want to lose one giraffe on the end when it can be scoring you, you know, again, more points based on how many watering holes and how many of that animal type you have it connected to. And when I mentioned tiny towns at the start of the video, so there's a few things that really remind me of tiny towns here. The first thing I'm going to mention is the fact that it is the simultaneous play with no downtime. And the fact that someone at the beginning of the turn, like everyone's playing together, but one person is going to determine what everyone does on their turn. So in tiny towns, let's say you call a resource, you say stone, and everyone has to take a stone and put it on their own board. So it's not a shared board. The interaction you have isn't a mean fighty. You can't destroy people's stuff, but you can kind of look around and think, I know that that person doesn't want me to call their, you know, the 2 elephant tile right now, but you can say 2 elephants, and everyone at the table goes, oh, I didn't want to move that one yet. I had to make space for it, kind of thing. So you have this aspect of everyone is dictating what everyone else is doing at the table, but you're not directly, you know, attacking or losing people points directly. You're just potentially making it difficult. But similar to Tiny Towns, you can also play it more heads down. You know, if you're a less experienced gamer or it's your first time playing and you don't want to be looking around at what's on other people's boards, you might just be looking down at what works for you. And sometimes that's good enough. And sometimes you're just trying to optimize your own little puzzle and see how many points you can get. And I think that's a great aspect for a family game because, you know, ultimately, again, this is branded as a family game. And ultimately, when you're going to be playing a family game, you're usually going to be playing with people of different ages, different experience levels, skill levels with games. So some players might want to just focus on their own puzzle and figure out how they can score the most points or how they can create room to get these certain animals grouped together, or where's the best spot on their board to put, you know, the watering hole tile that has all 6 animals so that they can connect as many of their types as possible. And it's only as you play the game more or you become more experienced where you start to suddenly, you know, there are certain elements of the strategy that start to kind of unravel a little bit over the first, second, third play. I'm not going to, pretend here that it's a game that has like crazy emergent strategies, 10, 20 plays in. Like after you've played it a couple times, you're going to see pretty much all there is to see in the game. So it's not to say that, it has like endless replay value or tons of variants that are going to make the game feel different every time. The base side of the game, the main side of the player board, has the same layout. So the variable setup comes from where you randomly distribute the animal tiles. So the puzzle is going to be different every time, but your goals are always going to be the same. The game does provide some variability beyond the initial setup by having some variants where you can flip over the board, and in this box with your tiles come these additional basically trees and bushfire tiles, so that on the other side of the board it's pretty much blank, and players can together decide where to set up those grass and trees at the start and the bushfires, so that you're all playing with the same board still. You're all going to set it up the same way, but you're going to be playing with different than the main side. So the rulebook comes with a couple different suggestions for alternate boards you can play with, or you can just experiment and try what you want. You can put all those tiles next to each other, or spread them out equally. However you want to do it, that definitely provides some kind of replayability to the game as well. So I want to go back to the Tiny Towns comparison for a second, because it's one of those things, it compares super well to Tiny Towns in the sense that, first off, you have a spatial puzzle. It's really tough to find the space to do everything you want. Tiny Towns has many fewer spaces, and really, I don't want to get too carried away because they do play very, very differently, but there's some similar ideas, and the idea that you're calling that tile that everyone has to pick means that the game gets more potentially mean, or you have less control over things the more players you have. So this plays 1 to 4 players. I've played the solo mode, I've played it with 2, and I've played it with 4. It works really well at all player counts, and the length of the game is pretty similar across all player counts. Like, if you're playing solo, you might sit there really trying to optimize everything most. Like, technically solo should be the fastest, because you're never ever going to be, when you play with more players, you might go and then someone else says, wait, I just have to figure where this tile's going, and there might be the occasional waiting, or, at the scoring at the end, if you're scoring 4 players' scores one at a time rather than just your own, technically it should take a little longer with 4 than solo, but it's pretty much the same length. The box has 20 to 40 minutes, and I think that's pretty accurate. I think when I played solo, it probably took me about 20, 25 minutes, and when I played with 4 players, it probably took a little longer, especially because I was teaching people for the first time. But again, it's such a quick teach. It plays so quickly, but the more players you add, if you're playing solo, you should be able to get a better score because you get to choose which tiles you move and when. You can say, I don't want to move that one yet. I'm going to move this one this turn. Okay, I'm going to move this one. So it's really the optimization puzzle. Whereas the more players you add, let's say you're playing with 4 players, you only get to choose what you're moving 1 in every 4 turns. So then 3 turns are going to happen where someone else is calling, the elephant and zebra tile and you don't want to move that. And then someone else is calling this watering hole tile and you didn't want to move that yet. And then finally it comes around to you and you have to really make your turn count in terms of what animal tile you pick to actually move around. So, and again, we talk about, the interactivity and how you can kind of pick stuff that's going to affect other players. With 4 players, your first game, you're not going to be looking around thinking, oh, what's going to hurt that player? What does that player not want to move? What does that player... You're probably going to, your first game, or the more players you play with, you're probably going to focus more on your own board kind of thing. But I think it works really well at all player counts because it gives you... It's a very similar game across all player counts. It scales very well, but it also feels like if you want that added interactivity from your games and that's what you want and you want the added challenge, then the more players you add, the more challenging it's going to be, no question. And some of those aspects I highlighted are among my favorite aspects of the game, and that's what I'm going to focus on now, is what are the things I think the game succeeds at best. The fact that it scales well at all player counts, the fact that it's, honestly, of any game I've played in a while, it might have one of the simplest rule sets. Like, I explained almost basically the entire game to you in about a minute there. It's so quick to teach, very quick to play as well. You can play this with kids, with adults of any age, any experience level of games. It's super easy for basically anyone to pick up. No downtime, so no one's really just like sitting around the table waiting. And for a family game, I think this does an excellent job. There are some family games where I think, the adults kind of have the upper hand, or the more experienced gamer has the upper hand, and I don't think that's the case necessarily with Savannah Park. And it's also not a game where the same player is going to win every time. I think there's enough randomness in the setup with the different tiles going in different places where you can really, have a tough time. You can feel like your setup has put things in a difficult way. And the other thing is, even though it is technically an optimization puzzle where you're trying to squeeze the most points as you can out of everything, there's no such thing as just solving the game and then getting the same high score, always beating. It's not like those roguelike games where you're always going to do better because you've figured something out. There's sometimes going to be a new obstacle, especially when you're playing with more players who are going to look at your board and see that you have something going and they can kind of throw a wrench in your plans a little bit here and there. So I like that it is still an optimization puzzle that makes you feel like you want to come back and do better, but it's not something that once you solve, you're going to just put the game back and never want to play it again. So a couple things. I don't personally have like a ton of complaints about the game. I think it works really well in a lot of ways. I'm going to highlight a couple things that I don't like, as well as some things that I think other people might not like. So one thing is just from a tactile standpoint, the tiles slide around a lot. If you bump the table or bump your board, the tiles can go everywhere, and there's like, even, because a lot of the tiles are very close together, sometimes you go to pick one up and you have to move a bunch of, and you kind of push a bunch of tiles over, so you're often trying to like push everything back into place. Maybe a dual layered player board would have been nice here so that they kind of sit into the board a little better, similar to like if you played a game like Calico where everything kind of sits in there nicely. So there are sometimes going to be some issues with that. It's tough to pick up the tiles without pushing everything around kind of thing. And even with the variable setup, you still have the same goals. So even though there's different stuff bringing you back, there isn't a ton of variety in terms of you're not going to have like a brand new experience with the game every time. So if what you're looking for is something that you want to like explore in depth, then there might not be that added level of kind of, exploration bringing you back into the game. The other couple things are that setup can feel a little bit long for what the game is, as well as the scoring. Like, because the game is so short, but to take out all the tiles, you have to mix them all up in a way, because sometimes you just throw them back in the box, stacked up the way you had the animals organized. You have to flip them all over onto a certain side, put them all on your board. So like, for how quick the game is taught and how quick it plays, the setup feels maybe just a tad long for what it is, but honestly, that's a very, very small complaint. And the other thing I want to mention real quick is that this doesn't bother me personally, but maybe one day, like, I have a very young baby right now, but maybe one day if I'm playing this with my family, I could see this potentially being an issue. For some people, because the scores are so potentially high in this game, like you can score over 200 points, there's the possibility for the scores to be very far apart. Like, this isn't one of those games where you're just automatically going to get points everywhere. Like, you could do poorly and not get a very high score. And I could see, if you play this with like young kids and, they've lost by like 50, 60, 70 points or something, like that can be a tough pill to swallow, right? In games where a winning score is like 20 or 30, if someone loses by, 8 points, that doesn't seem like a big deal. The number 8 is a small number, but even though if you score 200 and your child scores 175, sure, they were fairly close. Like, they're not in the grand scheme of things. Like, the ratio of points that they are behind you isn't that far. But to say that they've lost by 25, like, the score track goes pretty far around this board, and you could look at it and think, wow, I was so far behind. So just keep that in mind. You know, if you think that your kids or whoever you're playing this with in your family might have a tough time feeling like they've lost by a lot or seeing themselves really far back on the score track, just keep that in mind. I don't think it's really like a negative of the game, but I think it is something worth keeping in mind depending on the age level and experience level of the people you're playing the game with. So overall, what do I think of the game? Honestly, as a family game, for what it sets out to do, I think this does an excellent job. I think this is a game that I will happily keep in my collection and will be playing for years. It's not something that, you know, I'm someone who, you know, has a collection of 100 plus games. So when I like host a game night and I invite my friends over who are like, you know, my most experienced gamer friends, like, I'll be honest, this isn't the game we're ever going to pick up off the shelf to play. But this is kind of a relaxing game that I might play at home with my wife once in a while. Or if I'm playing with less experienced gamers, or we're just looking for something a little more, you know, we can converse about, you know, how did the weekend go kind of thing. And we want just like, you know, something that feels more like a more laid-back kind of game, or something that doesn't require like full-on attention where you're like, oh, I really need to think about my turn, just be quiet kind of thing. It works really well in that sense. There's a lot to like. I really enjoy it. I'll probably enjoy it every time I play it. I don't think I'm ever going to turn down a game of this, but for me, it doesn't do enough new over repeated plays to have me feel like I personally want to come back to it over and over. But then again, this is specifically designed in the Capstone family line of games. So as a family game, it's honestly one of the better ones I've played over the last few years. I think the kind of animal theme in the savannah is something that's going to attract a lot of people and appeal to a lot of gamers. And again, I think it sets out what it does to do super well with the very easy to learn rules, quick playtime with no downtime really. So that's pretty much all I have to say about Savannah Park. I will mention real quick actually that there are two variants that come in the game. One is a variant for children, I think it says, where they basically just, I think they eliminate the negative points for covering up the grass and the trees or something along those lines. I haven't played with that one just yet. And there's also a lion variant where you get this lion token, and basically this adds just another level of planning and strategy to the game. This would be if you're playing with someone more advanced who wants that extra level. The idea is that the lion starts on a spot at the start of the game, and that anytime you move a tile to a space that has the lion, you're going to score that a number of points based on how many animals. So if there was 2 animals on the tile and you moved it, you're then going to move the lion to a different empty space, and you'll score, let's say, 2 points for the 2 animals that were on that space. So it's an extra way to get little boosts of points throughout the game and reward you for your planning. And by doing that, it also makes the game more interactive because players can see what you might be trying to move to where your line is, where you're trying to build, and then they might make decisions on what animal tiles they call based on that. So it's a clever little thing because it's literally just one piece and very simple rules, but it's a variant that adds just a little bit extra to the game, so definitely worth checking out. Otherwise, that is the review of Savannah Park. Thank you again to Capstone Games for sending us this review copy. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking or subscribing. It really helps our channel out. Otherwise, that's all I have for today, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.